Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending. My name is Linda Hiember, and I welcome you to Seattle University School of Law webinar series for our online Masters of Legal Studies in Compliance and Risk Management. Today's topic focuses on an important issue globally, but especially for our community: compliance with a conscience and advancing racial justice. I serve as Senior Director of Graduate Law Programs at the law school, and I oversee both campus and online programs for the Masters of Legal Studies, as well as postdoctoral work for lawyers. This Master of Legal Studies is not a law degree in that it would enable you to practice law, but it is a legal studies career that allows for quasi-legal positions and an understanding and framing of issues and problems through the lens of the law. We like to say we help you think like a lawyer without being one. Today's agenda, we will focus on our program motto, compliance with a conscience, and how you emulate that in actions. Our guest presenter is a valued member of our community as an alumni, as a member of our affiliate faculty, and as a practitioner in this space. So I'd like to introduce David, please.
Hi, really wonderful to have everyone here. My name is David Chen. As Linda said, I am an affiliate faculty at Seattle University School of Law. And since this is a global presentation, I won't wish you a happy day or a happy evening, but whatever time it is, I hope you're doing well and staying safe. If you are in the United States, you may know that it's Black History Month, which is an important month of recognition for us here stateside, and something that we are happy to celebrate as part of Seattle University, and something that we're excited to talk about today in advancing racial justice and equity. And today, and specifically talking about my talk, we're going to be talking about structural racism as it appears in the compliance framework, and how we think about those things as potentially compliance professionals. And as you look at different programs, how those applicabilities would be in your practice and what you do. As Director Hiember said, I am a general counsel and director of legal affairs and compliance at my organization, which is a technology firm here in Seattle. I've been practicing for about 10 years as an attorney, but have very much loved compliance and ethics work for about 6.5 of those years, building programs and strategic frameworks for my organization and others, which I have the opportunity to serve as a volunteer board member. And then my undergraduate degrees from here locally as well at Western Washington University. We have some great network partnerships, but if you ever need to reach me or want to connect, feel free to look me up on LinkedIn at David-Chen-Seattle. Love to connect with you.
Thank you, David. And for those in attendance, because we're recording this session, we will have this archive available, but you could always contact me to get David's contact information or any other contact information you'd like from any of our faculty, or even student ambassadors who would love to share their experience with this program or their work in this space. This is my contact information too. You can always call me at 206-398-4268. And again, I think just covering the importance of compliance with a conscience and raising awareness as practitioners, as voices for the voiceless, that it's almost impossible to separate out a compliance professional or quasi-legal professional's role in speaking and furthering a culture for diversity, inclusion, and equity. So, David, please.
Fantastic, thank you. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and Director Hiember will be able to relay those either directly during conversation. It's always good. I'm a huge fan of interactive processes, so feel free to type those in chat, and we'll have those discussions together as we continue. But just to cover off on what we're talking about today in advancing racial equity, I want to at a very, very high level talk about what we're addressing and try to explain some of the different terminologies that we're facing. We understand more and more in this day and age, in this global awakening and this conversation in the United States following the murder of George Floyd last summer. These conversations are structural in nature. Lived experiences for each of us are extraordinarily important. And I won't downplay how important it is that we talk about that, but I want to make sure that we are talking today about structural racism and what it means to be in a history of the types of frameworks and the types of rules that may have occurred that structurally cause imbalance and lack of access and equity to different individuals, and how thinking about that as a compliance professional is key to being successful in the 21st century, and how the hypothesis of today and the challenge that I address you all with is that talking about racism and advancing racism is no longer the conversation around how to remove ourselves from a post-racial environment, i.e. to not talk about the issue. It's extremely important to talk about the issue, and more important to address the fact that inaction is perpetuation of the challenges that we have. And that if we don't actually look at the structures that we think are standardized, or we think that potentially are colorblind, we actually are perpetuating the continued challenges of the structural racism at hand, which ultimately, we're talking about outcomes, is disparity of the results and the opportunities and the equity that individuals of different ethnic and racial backgrounds have globally and locally. So in order to discuss that in a more global setting, I really wanted to make sure we also discussed what we're looking at when it comes to methodologies of addressing racism. The next slide I'll show you, which we won't go to yet, but we'll show sort of one of my favorite kind of kid books. If you grew up reading Shel Silverstein, who's kind of a famous American author, shows the different types of addressing structural issues within our community, and how maybe that thinking has advanced over time. And how we now, as a hypothesis, have to really address not only the idea that individuals that are facing structural inequities because of racism potentially need additional inputs because of the lack of equity through generational impacts, but we actually need to talk about the barriers that are unseen to individuals of different races and different communities, and how the approach itself is under question. The approach of a society where we simply don't have to worry about race is actually one that's perpetuating those structural racist issues. One really important change that's happened in the United States over time is a change in administration, which just occurred just a month or two ago. And so we're now talking about how those approaches are different. So one thing we're going to talk about is the executive order that's come from the current administration under President Joe Biden, as it's a revocation of the previous order under the administration of President Donald Trump, and how those differences might come about. I also want to do a short case study. In my experience working in the Health and Human Services centers and centers of Medicare and Medicaid services, I help to run nursing homes, which are both related to those agencies. And so I just wanted to expose and highlight how this hypothesis might come up in that type of agency. The last part I want to invite us all to think about is our actions, and how we might look at a framework around those actions, and how that framework is going to talk about two what we call legal doctrines or theories. And the two that you call them is one called disparate treatment and disparate impact. And I'll explain more what those mean because they're a little bit lofty in idea, but the idea being disparate treatment is a sort of a low bar idea that we've often thought about, which is the behavior or the conduct or the issue that we're looking at directly related as having a connection to race and treating individuals of different race or ethnicity differently? Or is it disparate impact, where potentially something that we create or do is meant to be standardized, meant to be colorblind? However, we're seeing in the outcomes that there's a disparate impact on people of minority beliefs or minority race and ethnicities, right? And so in the United States, we often talk about individuals that are Black and Indigenous, because we have a very clear social dynamic there where systemic racial barriers have existed over generations that continue to cause these structural inputs. And now we have to look at whether or not the standardizations that we do in compliance potentially impact those. So I hope that's a clear outline of what we'll talk about today. And if you have any questions about that, feel free to put them in chat. So we'll talk about a change in approach. We talked a lot about the current administration. And so when we talk about compliance with a conscience, what we really are also talking about then is, what does your conscience actually tell you to do? And what's the mission and purpose of it, what it means to be a compliance professional in the United States? Oftentimes, many programs may just talk about, we're trying to meet enforcement requirements and rules and continue business. For me as a practitioner, and for me as having the opportunity to help lead in this discussion for Seattle University and teach some of the classes, it's just not enough. It's not sufficient to make compliance professionals excel at their work. We have to think beyond just the enforcement and the basic understanding of business continuity for the sake of avoiding fines and lawsuits, et cetera, but what do we as compliance professionals actually bring to the business and talk about in a social justice narrative to advance what it means to be part of a great organization and create good culture? So the change in approach in this executive order is an important one to highlight, because yes, it was a revocation of the previous order. So there was an order put into place at the end of 2020 by President Donald Trump, which said we weren't allowed to talk about diversity. We weren't allowed to talk about race or other gender issues that were what were called lightning rod issues in the federal workplace or in federal contracts. So the idea being that we could advance race equity by not talking about it anymore, that everyone should just treat each other the same and everyone should just be nice to each other and no longer have these programs which were causing these dilemmas. Well, the other approach, and the approach that the current administration is taking now, and one that compliance professionals are really going to take heed of, is that the approach is an affirmative one. It's one in which those racial justice determinants not only need to be measured, but that colorblind programs are not in fact advancing racial equity. And so the new executive order, which is 13985, which replaced the prior administration's order, is working on structural racism in the basis that individuals, and this is a famous quote, are like fish that don't see water. They don't realize they're in these structural racist environments because all of those standardizations were built potentially on the history or on the structures that were engendered racism back in the past or even now, and they continue to perpetuate, i.e. disparate impact on individuals of color. So Black and Indigenous and people of color, BIPOC is what we often use the terminology here in the States. The last piece, which is really important and something that you need to take into consideration as a compliance professional, is data. And what we're doing is conducting racial equity assessments. Oftentimes in compliance, you'll hear sort of the terminology of the carrot and the stick. I really don't like that terminology because it suggests that there's two kind of clear aspects. There's not. There's a holistic framework that goes into compliance, some of which are, yes, things like grants and contracts and access to different types of systems and different types of resources, which can be called the carrot. And then there's enforcement programs and agencies, often called the stick. I believe holistically, we can't look at them separately. And I think where this executive order actually falls a little bit short is it really talks about access to programs and not necessarily also talking about what are the standard enforcement and the standard frameworks that potentially could have a disparate impact on people of color. So moving on, the Equitable Data Working Group is an important aspect of that, but that's fine. Go ahead, Linda.
Okay.
That's just a side note. That
quick with the mouse.
Yeah, the Equitable Data Working Group is the place where that conversations will happen. So this is what I talked about before. This is a really important aspect, and it's a really great way to break down what I just kind of outlined as the difference in methodologies that we have to talk about in any environment that's talking about race. Whether we like it or not, we have to address the fact that individuals are having different reactions to advancing racial justice. And at the end of the day, there's a conversation that needs to be had around what our maturity level is and what your organization or any organization that you consider working for, where their maturity level and conversation appetite is around the difference between, the basic understanding of equality, i.e. the top right corner, where the two young boys are picking apples and they have the same size ladder. That's equal. So potentially, they're not addressing the systemic issues that the tree is inherently tilted towards one ladder or the other, but the ladders themselves are equal, so why shouldn't it be fair? The next level, of course, is equity. Equity means that the conversation changes to the individual that has that ladder tree or the access to resources tilted away from her or him now has a taller ladder to reach those things. And then the last level, which we're talking about, is a strategic planning framework around what is justice. Do we actually look at the tree itself and say there's something about the system that's causing, as I said, disparate impacts on one boy versus the other, and this example of being analogous to different types of racial groups. And those disparities actually need to be addressed by addressing the very root of the system itself, i.e. the tree, and fixing those problems. And that's our hypothesis here today, is that as compliance leaders, do we want to join organizations that are teaching us and learning that yes, we could live in a world where we just have to have the same size ladder and therefore we're continuing our business or whatever it is? Or do we really want to actually be compliance leaders that are challenging ourselves to think about the tree and saying that there are barriers potentially that are having inequality at the root of the system? So moving on, I want to do a really quick case example of how this might show up so that it can be very clear to folks that may be interested in learning more about this program and learning about what it can teach us. I, for example, worked, I said, in nursing homes and healthcare systems. Very, very large, complex systems, as many are. You could supplant any of these types of conversations with tech or with data privacy, et cetera, where you have lots and lots of people that are talking about a very, very standardized and complex system. Sorry, Linda, we swapped off. Let's go back.
Yes, still having.
That's all right. That's perfect.
And I
if there's any
apologize.
questions,
Just reinforcing the learning.
right? Yeah. If there's any questions, again, feel free to pop them in the chat, and we can address them. So there's two organizations that monitor nursing homes and other convalescent or rehab facilities in the U.S. The larger organization, the umbrella organization, is the Health and Human Services Department. And then underneath that, there's two branches, which is the OIG, which stands for Office of Inspector General. That's the audit and kind of attorneys and inspectors that go into looking at how to build a compliance program. And then there's a Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, or CMS, which actually looks at the things like how much money is going out and how much quality is going into the system. So let's think about ourselves as an individual patient, either a white patient or a Black patient in a very large system like this. It's really important to note that you're actually measured ultimately the care that you receive and the care that is paid on your behalf by the federal government in the same methodology. Well, the danger of that is that if you have, and they often say this, if you have a facility that's predominantly one race, i.e. Black, and many facilities that are another race, predominantly, i.e. white, and they're put into the same system, and you see the racial disparities within that system are hurting one community versus another. Well, the challenge as a compliance manager is that you may have facilities in your purview, in your scope of responsibility, that are both. And the danger becomes then, if you standardize them, that you know that you have to have facilities that are meeting quality goals or assessments in a certain way. You start putting your resources and your investment in time into those higher performing facilities. Well, that goes back to our previous drawing, which is the difference between equality and justice, right? Equality says, well, both facilities should get the same amount of resources and be taken care of the same way. And so be it if one facility is not doing as well as the other, they're getting the same inputs. Well, equity or justice would mean that if you see certain racial disparities occurring within a system, that you actually realize that those are structural in nature. It's not simply just, well, one facility is doing well and one facility is doing poorly. Generational trauma and addressing the type of inequities of lack of access of housing and capital and et cetera, are also pushing themselves into our healthcare disparities. And so it's very important as compliance professionals to ask ourselves the really hard question: do we really care about racial justice? And do we see disparate impact within the system that we're responsible for, where we need to have conversations and push the envelope towards being able to make sure those outcomes are fair and equivalent, even if additional resources need to be put towards minority predominant systems or minority predominant facilities, rather. So facilities that have more minorities in them. The data is clear. If you're Black in America, you have much higher rates of um, uh, obesity, much higher rates of lack of care within a healthcare facility, much higher rates of what are called comorbidities or poor outcomes and patient treatment. And they're not necessarily tied to individual providers. So when we talked back again about individualized racism, we often sort of asked ourselves, well, is it doctors and nurses and providers that are having disparate outcomes because they're assigning or giving disparate treatments to individuals of different races? What we've seen in the data is that's actually not true. So my hypothesis, and the hypothesis that I think we should all take into account, is could it be the system itself, that you're taking things that you're saying, well, I treat patient A who's white and patient B who's Black exactly the same, then how come patient B has less positive healthcare outcomes? Well, then I think we need to go back and ask ourselves, is the system in itself just and fair? And that's, as compliance professionals, a key aspect of what we do. All right, so how do we as compliance impact change? As I said, it's kind of a bit of a recap, but the danger of the carrot and stick mentality, you will often be asked in the compliance profession to look at things in a very narrow window, because the purpose of compliance in the less holistic sense is to meet the rules and requirements of enforcement. But I believe in a more holistic sense, in what Director Hiember is saying, if compliance with the conscience is that we are going to be holistic and we're going to actually work on the decisions as we inform them with data. What is the actual data of our organizations telling us beyond simply complying with the rules and regulations we're responsible for? I think, and other employers, I think, would agree with me that true compliance professionals that are making an impact on their organization are absolutely meeting the compliance requirements necessary for doing business, but then they're also adding value. They're creating a sense of equity, a sense of justice and culture, and a sense of inclusion within the actual outcomes of their business, not just in the narrow sense of compliance. So how do we do this? We actually look at all the activities that we do through a race equity lens. And a race equity lens means that what are the disparate impacts potentially of the types of programs that we run and the initiatives that we run. You might take your own case example, or you might look at what you do as a business and actually ask yourself, have I ever looked at that data? Have I ever stopped and said, do my minority employees have different outcomes than my majority employees, even though they're doing the same mandatory testing? Are we screening out certain types of employees that are minorities because we have a certain compliance requirement around standardization? Famous legal case out of the United States was a case where they required advanced degrees for individuals that were working and factory floors doing custodial work. And they asked themselves, well, why do you need that question? Why is that important? They said, well, it's just important because we want the best of the best people. And so what they realized was that it was actually screening out minority applicants from that role and that job, and it was having a disparate impact on them. There wasn't necessarily a connection where someone said, I want to do this because it will screen out minorities, which is a disparate treatment conversation. But there was an impact on, wow, this is impacting Black, Indigenous, and people of color wanting to seek these jobs and roles. And this advanced degree requirement had nothing to do with the job. It was something that a great janitorial custodial staff could do without that role. And I think that's what we have to do as compliance leaders, is to look at that race equity lens in our and how we treat ourselves and how we treat our systems.
David, excuse me, how, when we're talking about through our actions, through viewing through a race equity lens, you're talking about informed by data. But then there's also, how can these decisions, and is data too scrubbed? What if there aren't representatives of these minority groups or Blacks or other races? If they're not at the table, where is their voice and how can it be better heard?
Yeah, that's an absolutely fantastic question. And it actually is a great segue to talk about what we in the technology sphere, and especially as we talk about the rise of, machine learning or algorithms. So many of these decisions, Linda, as you said, are actually being made by data that's not available to human beings with, bleeding hearts and open minds with that are actually looking at it for outside of, well, what does the data say in just a scientific sense? It's called a socio-technical problem. And we're seeing that as it comes up through especially the type of patterns and algorithms that are being made by computers. And so those computers that are created by predominantly white employees are actually perpetuating those racial stereotypes. And that's a huge problem itself, is that we have to get more and more compliance professionals that represent the diversity of our community in all of its various colors and shades to actually be the ones that are working on the programs and asking themselves these hard questions, especially because sometimes the data just doesn't exist. There's lack of representative individuals to make that a statistically significant number.
And just on the side, I think the data does show that compliance and risk management roles, oftentimes, at least at a C-suite or close to it level, does still not have the inclusion and diversity that would be helpful to address these systemic problems and allow it through that race equity lens, correct?
That's absolutely right. And the more that we realize that, yes, there's absolutely a challenge of this data and this potential for standardization, where we just say, hey, we're just going to create this in a vacuum and we're going to apply that vacuum and not think about how it may impact people. The other side of it, and the reality is what we need to work on in our own personal lives, are relationships. And those relationships matter. If you don't create relationships with individuals of diverse backgrounds and diverse ideas at the highest levels of your organization, those relationships that are lacking diversity will inherently impact the types of decisions that get made and the systems that get selected to perpetuate some of these challenges.
And in a compliance role too, looking at compliance with conscience, what we face is the old method I know in the 80s, looking at environmental, do the minimum. What does the executive order of Joe Biden require? You're the compliance professional, just check the box and let's move it to the next silo. And I love that this evolving role and part of our program is designed to have people say, wait, you can be a leader, not just a box checker, and you could help change a culture from inwardly outwardly, rather than just where's the law and the policy and let's make sure we're in compliance.
Right. And the other side, it's really important to note, is that at the end of the day, structural racism is about history. It's about the lineages of things that have happened in the past and the the rules that have come out of it. And so we as Americans deal with slavery, and generational slavery has caused generational compliance laws to mimic those Jim Crow laws over time. And we have to address that as a community. And the danger of what not addressing that inherently is that we are saying that we understand our history in a vacuum, rather than saying, how does our history over time create those structures? And now that we've washed those structures, we don't realize that the tree continues to bend because it's been trained to be that way. Someone once told me, a really great thinker, oftentimes people say the system is broken. And his response was, the system's not broken. The system's actually perfectly designed to give the outcomes that it has. We just say the system is broken because it's an easy way for us to compartmentalize that we don't like certain aspects of the system. And so we sort of compartmentalize that as not being part of, well, maybe the system itself is structured poorly to have these disparate outcomes for people of minorities. And in particular, when you look at, the issues that are coming up now, there's just a great discussion around the word Jezebel, right? And that as being a structural aspect of understanding, and we as compliance professionals understand the years and years of generational oppression that have come through such a simple word, that now people are saying, well, that's not a racial word, that's just a word. Well, unless we address the history behind it and understand where it's coming from, we may not understand all of its racial impacts on our systems and our structures. And so race equity requires us to be great historians, but then also to be willing to accept the harsh realities of generational impacts that we've created.
And we do have one question that spawned my question that I synthesized, but the attendee has asked that instead of synthesizing the question, that I asked it directly, and I will honor that request. Shalise has asked and posed this observation that racial justice is another way to exclude Black folks, in parentheses, lineage to slavery. And so why are we using Black folks as a benchmark? There are more resources going to minority groups, not Black folks, and compliance professionals are not addressing this issue. And her query, can you address this issue, especially if Black folks are not at the table making the decisions?
Yeah, it hits the nail on the head, and there's no answer, there are outcomes. And so for me, I think as a community, we have to be outcome oriented, which is addressing exactly what that participant is saying, but then saying, what are the solutions to it? And the fact of the matter is, Black folks aren't at the table. And so what are we willing to do to elevate, empower, and celebrate Black excellence and Black history within our systems? And what are we actually, as I said, inactive about, and therefore by being inactive, perpetuating those systems and structures?
Thank you. So, Seattle University School of Law, trying to recognize our motto of compliance with conscience, our mission as an institution that emphasizes justice, social justice for all groups, and our ongoing, recognition of the need to improve inclusion and equity and access to both education and to these opportunities. We created our first fully online program that focuses on compliance and risk management. And this online part-time program has enabled people often from underserved or non-traditional students, people who can't come to campus, an opportunity to study and have either access to this career path or at least advancement within this career path. And what we found is that we have been attracting predominantly higher in demographics and ethnographics people who fall under often non-traditional or have not had the opportunity for these education levels. For example, our first cohort, this is a public demographic disclosures, 90% female, and 40% who identify in Black African American class. So this, we are bringing to the table, at least preliminarily, people who are interested in earning a graduate level degree in this area. And I think that slowly helps to move the needle, because with this degree, hopefully it opens up jobs in the career advancement or new career paths, where oftentimes, you know, everyone knew if you played golf with the vice president, you probably got a promotion. But now it's really about, you know, having those access. And Gina, just, this is on my bookshelf at all times, by the way, David. Shel Silverstein is brilliant, and children's books are not just for children. So that being said, there is another question or comment posed by Rosalind attending. And Rosalind writes, when people say that the system is broken, I think of them saying that it is humanizing systems of suffering from cognitive dissonance of promising safety of our society while simultaneously causing oppression. Question, what do you think about that alternative way of understanding what a broken system means? And I apologize if it's not coming through with clarity.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting and very intelligent methodology of looking at it. And you know, when you think about, are we humanizing systems of suffering and creating that compartmentalization for the sake of safety? I think that's absolutely true. I think maybe that is what people are trying to say. And I think a lot of those axioms that we sadly come up with are ways for distancing ourselves. And it's one of the challenges, you know, I think, you know, Professor Hiember, you'd feel the same way. The practice of law is challenging because many times there's cognitive dissonance in what we do. And I think it takes education, and it takes the willingness to create a curriculum that just says that, and we're willing to say it, that yes, absolutely, when you step into the Supreme Court, you don't actually have your clients there. You don't face the people that you're interacting with, and proximity is important.
Yeah, but I also think, you know, the part of this is as compliance professionals, as academics, as practitioners, and as humans, we acknowledge that we cannot see or frame it through the same lens through the people who experience this, and there's implicit biases, and and those opportunities. It's about, and I think we model well in our faculty and community in general, a humility and an acknowledgement that we don't always have all the answers, that we have to learn, and we have to strive to learn, and we have to find those solutions and realize we have to do it as a community, and we can learn from our students, and we can learn from our clients, and we can learn from data, but again, that human connection is just so critical. And then we have to take it back to the leaders. And sometimes you have to frame it in terms of the value back to the company, whether they see, you know, social as part of a sustainability. Unfortunately, you know, being able to change the culture, not down, but upward in organizations at the government level, at the NGO level, that the way we frame laws and policies is a challenge worth tackling. And this program, again, just in the way it's structured, it's designed for working professionals to be completed part-time, fully online in 2 years. So it's a 2-year program with 6 terms, 3 trimesters per year. And you take 2 courses, a total of 5 credits per term. And it's designed to prepare you both within your career or to begin a new career in the compliance or risk management fields, regardless of industry. So we give you solid legal foundations, Then you move to an operational phase where there's a lot of doing, a lot of skills learning. And you can choose, you're not required to, but you can choose a concentration or tract of study that emphasizes privacy and data, healthcare compliance or risk, corporate, which is often internal. A lot of people are interested in the HR role or ethics roles, like, and David, like your role, and finance, financial fraud issues, financial privacy. And then finally, the last phase is the action phase, where all students take a final elective and then submit a capstone project, a tangible project that would be part of an employment portfolio and demonstrate that their aptitude to be thought leaders in this space. And you would have the opportunity to study with faculty such as Professor Chen. And we really enjoy selecting faculty that are practitioners and scholars. So they bring real life case studies and experience to the classroom, and are also themselves working professionals who dedicate time and have the life work balance of being able to teach. And so they appreciate the challenges that many students face. So next steps, if you have questions or are interested in applying, I say apply now. You can contact us to discuss academic and financial aid options. We will respond promptly to all of your inquiries. And hopefully you will enroll and begin your journey with us and help us grow as an institution also. The deadline to apply is May 15th. And our fall term begins on September 7th. Now I open it up to any questions you may have or any additional comments or observations, David, that you may like to share.
Yeah, thank you so much. Happy to answer any questions. Sorry, that might be my feedback. But the other side of it, and I was thinking about Rosalind's question a little bit more too. It is important for us to realize that organizations and institutions like Seattle University are so critical because they're the spear point of the conversation of very challenging and difficult things, to ask these questions where organizations that are maybe in the business world cannot. And that's the reality of some of the places that we're at, is that to be able to have the academics and the people that can take the research and show it for what it is, especially when it comes to the fact that you may ask yourself if some of the challenges in compliance in these frameworks are inherently created as barriers to entry for individuals of persons of color, or inherently creating a segment of status quo. And I think we'd be remiss not to say that that's healthy and that's right to do, and we should do it in a respectful and ethical way. But we have to do it, and it's going to be hard. And I'm excited for what the future could bring with organizations that are deeply committed to this conversation.
Thank you. And I had a question generally about the program. Our master's degree program does not require a GRE or any entrance exam. To be eligible for this program, we just require a bachelor's degree. And I don't see any further typing of questions, and we do value everyone's time. So David, I just wanted to thank you again for your service to the school, and also your willingness to come and talk about a difficult topic. And I thank you. And for all those in attendance, I thank you for your time. We are available to answer any follow-up questions you have, and hope that you will consider joining our program and becoming part of our community. I do see a chat question come in. One moment, please. I got to thank you. And thank you, Catherine, and thank you all who participated and gave us your time and attention today. David, thank you, everyone. Please be well and take care.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.